All right, here we go. Dealing with Pythagorean relationships, and it says that there's 9 of these. Now it starts off saying that sine squared theta plus, sorry, sine of theta squared plus cosine of theta squared equals 1, and we know that already. And let's remind ourselves. If we've got our unit circle, any of the triangles on that unit circle, for example, if it was 30 degrees right here, the sine of 30 degrees would be our 1/2. The cosine of 30 degrees would be the square root of 3 over 2, and our radius is 1. And so let's test this out. Sine squared is going to be 1/2 squared plus cosine squared, square root of 3 over 2 squared, equals 1. And let's again test this, see if this is in fact true. So 1/2 squared is 1/4 plus the square root of 3 over 2 squared is 3 over 4, and that does in fact equal 1. So this is true, and you can test it out for all the rest of the right triangles on the unit circle, but it is always going to be true. And so I kind of rushed through that, but this part right here, to clarify, this means sine of theta squared. This is some shorthand for it. When you see the sine, then the squared, then the theta, it means sine of theta squared. It's just a shorthand notation for it. Now we've got, if we have that equation, the sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, and again, that's a Pythagorean relationship there. You can think of a squared plus b squared equals c squared. If we were to subtract cosine from each side, so subtract cosine from either side, here we go. There's minus cosine of theta squared minus cosine of theta squared from each side. That reduces down to just to 0. And now we have sine of theta squared equals 1 minus cosine of theta squared. And that's our second Pythagorean identity right here. If we had subtracted sine from each side from our original identity, this one here, right here, you really do need to memorize, but you in fact probably do have it memorized, since it's just a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and using the unit circle as our a, b, and c. So if we were to subtract sine squared from each side, we would end up with cosine of theta squared equals 1 minus sine of theta squared. All right. Now to find the rest of our identities, what we're going to be doing is now dividing by either cosine or sine, and we'll find the rest of these right now. So if we have sine squared of theta and we were to divide everything by cosine, let's try that out. So we're going to divide by cosine squared theta, cosine of theta squared, and cosine of theta squared. So dividing all 3 of the terms. Well, what is sine squared theta divided by cosine squared theta? And we know that sine divided by cosine is tangent, so it results in tangent of theta squared. Cosine squared divided by cosine squared, well, anything divided by itself is 1, so plus 1, equals, and then we have 1 divided by cosine squared. Well, hey, 1 divided by cosine, that's secant, so this is going to be secant of theta squared. There's our 4th trig identity. If we were to take this 1 minus cosine theta squared equals sine theta squared and divide everything by cosine, cosine squared rather, well, we get a similar kind of relationship. So this time we have that 1 divided by cosine, remember that's secant. So secant squared of theta minus 1 equals, and sine divided by cosine, that's tangent, so tangent of theta squared. Lastly, if we divided everything by cosine right here, on that third one, so cosine divided by cosine, that's 1 equals 1 divided by cosine, that's secant, so secant divided by cosine squared, so secant squared theta, minus, and sine divided by cosine, that's tangent, so tangent of theta squared. All right, now same idea, but now let's divide by sine squared. So where we have cosine here, now these are all going to be sine, and we'll get our last 3 identities. So dividing everything by sine of theta squared, divided by sine of squared of theta squared, and divided by sine of theta squared. And that'll be the same for all the rest of these as well as we get this last set of identities. So sine divided by sine, or sine squared divided by sine squared, is going to be 1 plus, now cosine divided by sine, well, that's the reciprocal of tangent, that's cotangent. So cotangent of theta squared equals, and then 1 divided by sine, that's cosecant. So cosecant of theta squared. There's our 7th identity. Next, divide everything in this one here by sine, and 1 divided by sine, that's cosecant squared of theta, minus, well, cosine divided by sine, that's going to give us cotangent. So cotangent squared of theta. And then sine squared divided by sine squared, well, that's going to be 1. And our last one, our 9th identity, dividing everything up here by sine, divided all by sine. Cosine divided by sine would give us cotangent of theta squared. Equals 1 divided by sine would give us cosecant of theta squared, minus, and sine squared divided by sine squared would give us 1. So here's our 9 different identities. This first one is really the main one you need to memorize. From there, the rest of them, just with a little bit of reasoning, a little bit of logic, you can reason through and find all the rest of them. But it all builds off of sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And with just a little bit of work, you can get all the rest of the 9. So don't necessarily spend any time memorizing those 9, but do definitely memorize that first one there. So, all right, hope that helped.